divorce grief is a type of complicated grief because it's not a simple, stable life where one thing happens, your dog dies, for example, and everything else remains the same. We talk about grief in terms of that type of loss. But in divorce grief, we're talking about a whole big basket of changes and losses. And each one of those is its own unique experience and something that you uniquely have to adjust to. Welcome to Being Dad After Divorce, a podcast aimed at helping you cope and co-parent well after your separation. I'm John Peters, and if you're new to this podcast, thanks for joining me today. If you want to go start at the beginning of the whole podcast series, I'll put a link up here at the top, and you can jump there and start at the beginning and come up to here, or you can watch this one and then go watch the other episodes that might be helpful for you later. So in today's episode, I want to talk a little bit about grief. And I'm not doing this to bum you out, but I am assuming that you're dealing with a lot of changes. You're dealing with some things that you're losing, and you're having a grief reaction. And I want to take a little bit of time here in this podcast episode to talk about just a basic understanding of grief, because grief can be overwhelming, but it's also something that we can deal with effectively. And if we understand a few key things about grief, then we tend to handle it better. So the simple goal here is I want you to be less miserable. And part of how we can do that together is I can share some things that I've learned as a therapist working for 3 decades with a lot of people going through lots of different types of grief processes. And also as a therapist, as I've said, who has worked with thousands of separating and separated parents to help them with their divorce grief. So in today's episode, I'm going to talk about grief in some general ways, but give you some specific advice to help you handle your grief better. But I'm going to have some follow-up episodes also on the topic of grief, where I talk about some special issues related to grief as it applies to your role as dad, and also considering grief in the context of co-parenting. So what are we talking about when we talk about grief? What does the term grief even mean? Grief is the process of psychologically experiencing and reacting to change or loss. And we're talking about emotional reactions, thoughts, feelings, but also changes in what we're actually doing and changes in who we are. Our identity changes when we experience change or loss. And we have to adjust to being a new person experiencing a new universe often. And divorce is, as I've talked about before, it's one of the most stressful life events because it includes so many changes that we have to adjust to, all bundled together and happening in a short period of time. Okay, that's one reason it's so stressful. That's also a reason to believe that divorce grief is a type of complicated grief, because it's not a simple, stable life where one thing happens, your dog dies, for example, and everything else remains the same. We talk about grief in terms of that type of loss. But in divorce grief, we're talking about a whole big basket of changes and losses. And each one of those is its own unique experience and something that you uniquely have to adjust to. Okay, so it's a complicated situation of grief. So one of the points I want to make here is that you and I, we live in a world that has certain notions about grief. And one of the things I've noticed as a therapist and having many, many people come talk to me about the grief is that 90% of people feel like they're grieving wrong. They're not doing it right. And this is a very common issue. The reality is almost all of those people who think that they're not doing it right are actually doing it fine, and they're not doing it wrong. Part of the reason we think we're doing it wrong is because it's just so miserable. And we think anything that feels this bad must be not right, you know? But even if you're doing grief right, it's going to feel bad. But that's one of the reasons people get confused about it. But one of the things that I want to try to correct with you in this discussion, and also that I work with my patients, is that we often feel like we're doing it wrong because we have this idea that it's supposed to happen in a certain way. And you may be familiar with this idea because it's been very pervasive since the middle of the last century, and it's still very, very dominant in our society. And the idea is that grief happens in stages, and the grief stages are particular stages. Okay? This was introduced decades ago by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and we still all talk about the stages of grief. And long story short, Kubler-Ross was writing at a time where other stage models were very influential in psychology. And what a stage model means is we have something that develops, it goes through stages, and you have to do stage 1 before you can successfully do stage 2. And you have to accomplish stage 2 before you can get to and accomplish stage 3. That's a stage model. And that was part of Sigmund Freud's psychological model of human development. It was part of Piaget's model of child development. It was part of Erikson's model of human moral development. Okay, so all of that stuff has been dominant, continues to be dominant. And Kubler-Ross borrowed that when thinking about how people evolved through their grief process. And even though later in her career, Kubler-Ross herself said, no, it doesn't really happen that way. You can't put the toothpaste back in the toothpaste tube once it's out. I mean, the stage model, as she described and people adopted, made people think we've got these stages. So what are the stages of the traditional grief stage model? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Okay? And what we all think we know about that is that these stages are going to be there, and they're characterized by those particular flavors. There's the flavor of denial, the flavor of anger, the flavor of bargaining, the flavor of depression, the flavor of acceptance. And this is problematic in a number of ways. For one thing, we don't see all of those flavors with all people in the grief process. Some people aren't particularly angry. Some people actually aren't particularly sad about certain changes and losses. Some people don't engage in a lot of bargaining. Some people don't seem to have a stage of denial, okay? Sometimes these things are present, but it's a mix of things at the same time. So they're not sequential, like one precedes the other one. Sometimes people have something that they think is evidence of moving through the stages, and then they go backward, okay? And they think that they're somehow losing ground or reverting or failing, right? So the stage model does a disservice for people when people compare their experience of grief with the model and say, I don't fit the model, so I must be doing it wrong. But that's often not true. It's just that there's this model, it predicts certain things, and your experience doesn't fit the prediction. But that actually, most of the time, means the model is a problem, not you. So the short of that is to say, if right now you don't seem to be fitting in neatly into these stages, you're probably fine. If you're having a mix of emotions about a mix of things at the same time, that's normal. And you don't need to try to be angry or not be angry because you think that that doesn't fit with the stage you're in, right? One time I was teaching a divorce workshop, and I was talking about emotional reactions and grief and adjustment and things like that. And I paused the workshop to ask for questions. And there was this couple in the workshop that raised their hands and they said, we have a question. The question was, our son knows about the divorce. He doesn't seem to be particularly angry about the divorce. Should we talk to him more about the divorce so he can get angry and work through the anger stage of grief? That was their question. It's a common question, right? And it's the thing that we therapists encounter so often because of the dominance of this stage model. They were assuming denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And the son wasn't seeming angry, so they thought, well, he can't get through the grief process to acceptance because you got to get through the angry stage. And that has to come after denial and before bargaining, right? My answer to them, and I'll explain to you, is don't worry about it. Your kid will be angry enough about enough things soon enough, right? Plus, when I asked him how old the kid was, he was 4. 4-year-olds are oblivious to a lot of the things we're worried about and angry about anyway. So they get angry because they get 1 cookie instead of 2 cookies, things like that. So, point number 1, grief does not happen in stages. Point number 2, related to that, is wherever you are, it's usually a mix of things. So it's not a clean, discrete, monochrome, I'm in the anger stage and everything is about anger, and it's not about feeling sad. It's not about bargaining. It's not about denial. I mean, don't try to force yourself into that particular type of box. Okay. Another thing is that it's inadequate in terms of emotions, because in the stage model, we've got anger and we've got sadness, depression, basically. But the reality is we feel a mix of a lot of different kinds of emotions. Emotion researchers say that there's 420 different flavors of human emotion. And in any given moment, we're often feeling a mix of emotions about life, not just one emotion, although we obviously have moments where we kind of talk about our emotional experience as I'm angry right now, right? And we exclude other aspects of it. But the reality is emotional life is a big mix of things. And another point I want to make about the stage model is that this idea of acceptance is kind of a myth, because whatever we're grieving, the changes and losses that we're going through a grief process in response to, those things are very significant experiences in our life. They're part of who we are. They come along with us. And a lot of parts of our life, like I was married to my first wife for 10 years. That was a big part of my life. It comes along with me, right? If acceptance means unaware and totally unaffected, I will never be totally unaware and totally unaffected by a 10-year period of my life. It's just not going to happen, right? So acceptance in the pure sense often makes people feel like a failure because they might be months or years out from a change or loss. They might have a sense of coping with it really well and not being too negatively affected. And then something triggers them and they have a moment of really strong grief. And they think, well, I have failed because somehow I was supposed to be magically protected from that type of experience because I had reached the mountaintop of acceptance, right? And that's supposed to be unassailable, and you're not supposed to revisit things. But the reality is things come along with us, right? I had a dog that I had to put down years ago, and it was very sad at the time. And I got through it and adjusted to that. And then about like 2 years after that, I had this one day where I was watching a news story about a dog that was being put down. And it made me really, really sad. I was remembering my former pet and I was feeling really sad about it. Okay. Does that mean I failed to achieve acceptance about the loss of that dog? No. It just means it came back up. Okay. We don't want it coming up all day, every day, forever in the same way, right? And I'll talk about that in a second when I give you the alternate model that we use for grief these days. But acceptance is a myth. We don't get full closure over most things in life. We get relative acceptance, we get relative closure. We function, we get along, we find ways to be happy and satisfied and fulfilled in our lives despite having gone through periods of misery, okay? But we don't achieve some sort of perfect escape from former misery. Okay, stuff comes along with us. So what do we do if the stage model is a problem in multiple ways? What is a better way to think about grief? And the current idea to talk about grief in more supportive ways and to not lock us into some of the problems and limitations of the stage model is today we talk about the tasks of grief. And we talk about tasks instead of stages because tasks don't have to be sequential and one following the other. Tasks are things that sometimes we can do at the same time. We have the term multitasking to talk about, I could be on the phone while eating a sandwich and typing an email, right? We can multitask in lots of aspects of our life. And in grief, there are tasks that relate to experiencing and responding well to the grief. And we identify those as specific grief-related tasks. And the reality is, if you look at what people actually do through the grief process, you see that they are accomplishing these tasks, sometimes in overlapping ways, working on more than one task at the same time. And the tasks also are more broadly defined so that they include a more wide variety of experiences. So whereas in the stage model, we've got the second stage being anger, which kind of eliminates a lot of other aspects of experience. In the task model, we talk about just emotions, not just anger, not just sadness, okay, but emotions. And it captures the breadth and variety of human experience much better, okay? So in the task model, here are the 4 tasks. And this will make more sense once I explain them to you, and it'll make more sense why the task model is actually a better way to think about grief than the stage model. But before I describe the task, basically, if you're enjoying this type of content and it's helpful, hit the like button below, please. And if you're yet to subscribe to the channel, please subscribe. If you have comments that you'd like to share, please comment below. And if you think this video is helpful for a friend, feel free to send it to them or post it to your social media. It helps the channel. But back to the tasks, okay? So the main task model has 4 tasks. And it's not 1 and then you do 2 and then you do 3 and then you do 4. It's just there are 4. And you may or may not be doing any particular one at any given moment, okay? But 2 of them relate to emotions and 2 of them relate to adjustment and identity adjustment, okay? So one of the tasks is to actually accept the reality of the change or changes or loss and to be working with what is. And what I mean by that is, let's say the bus that runs by my house that I ride to work for some reason decides to take away that bus stop. It's not going to stop there anymore. So I've lost the opportunity to get on the bus in front of my house to go to work, okay? If I don't actually deal with that directly, I'll get up, get ready for work, and go stand at the bus stop waiting for the bus to come by, and it's not, okay? So this may sound like a silly task, but part of what we have to deal with on the very practical level of life is dealing with what is. And divorce is a complicated set of many, many changes, and not all of it is clear. A lot of it's confusing about how do I adjust to this, how do I adjust to that, right? But somehow to make healthy changes in response to whatever has changed or we've lost, we have to deal with what is as opposed to what should have been or what was or what we want to have happen, okay? So that's one task. And when we talk about someone accomplishing that well, we mean that we're observing that the person is dealing with what actually is relatively competently and not getting misguided and dealing with it incompetently, okay? The second task related to that identity change is that over time, you adjust to a new identity, a new you that is the you that now exists in the universe, having had things change. Okay. And this, in some respects, is often a slow process because if, for example, you've been married to your partner for a long time, with your partner for a long time, you're not necessarily going to wake up the day after you separate and have a sense of yourself as not being that person's partner. Even if you don't want to be that person's partner, even if you're accomplishing the first task, and you are dealing with what is, the reality is we are just designed to keep that momentum of our identity and our life going, and it can feel very ungrounding to suddenly be single, having been partnered for a long time. And why does it feel ungrounding? Because your identity was you as the partner of that person. And when things change, like your relationship with that person and your relationship with your kids and where you're living and all sorts of things, you need some time to adjust to the point where you feel settled and more okay with life as it is configured after that separation. Okay, but that's one of the tasks, is adjusting to life and an identity as things have changed. And obviously, this becomes more easy to do when things stay stable, which isn't always something people can accomplish quickly. You know, like I've talked to people who didn't have a stable residence for months after separation for financial reasons or logistical reasons. And so it was hard to feel at home wherever they were living for a while until they had a stable place that they could kind of situate and relate to as home. Okay. So one of the third task I'm going to talk about, it has to do with emotions. And it has to do with being able to feel and constructively work with the emotions that are related to the experience of the changes or losses. And what does that mean? That means that, you know, some changes that you have been experiencing are frustrating. Some of them are saddening. Some of them are angering. Some of them produce other kinds of emotional qualities. And when we talk about emotional health, part of what we talk about is whether or not emotional reactions are congruent, that they fit with the experience, and also whether they're proportional, like what's the magnitude, what's the volume level of the emotion. Now, some people have deficits and pitfalls already inherently kind of wired into the situation in their psyche prior to experiencing the things that are triggering them emotionally. So, for example, if you have Joe Smith and Joe has a really bad anger problem, he has low frustration tolerance, he doesn't handle his anger well, then when anger, which is a normal thing to experience during grief, and especially during divorce grief, when anger gets triggered for Joe, he may not experience and respond to that in a healthy way. Okay? He may have an extra challenge of dealing with that aspect of his emotional experience through and after the divorce. So, task 3 is being able to feel and respond to those feelings in a reasonably constructive and healthy manner, and to work with those feelings, that emotional experience, in a way that ultimately is constructive and supportive of that person's overall good mental health and good emotional health. Okay? Which again is not a stage, it's not a task you can accomplish in a day. It's a process of being healthy, trying to get healthier. And a lot of factors relate to this, like, are you getting good emotional support? Are you avoiding alcohol? Are you getting good sleep? Are you exercising? And all these things. I've talked about that a little bit before, these foundational things that make it more likely that you're going to generally cope well with the adjustments through and after the divorce. The fourth task in the task model, which again is not number 4 as in we get to number 4 at the end, right? But it's most related to that idea of acceptance in the stage model. And that is that we emotionally relocate the things that have changed, the experiences of the changes, the experiences of the loss. And what does emotionally relocating mean? Well, as each moment passes in our life, we move forward on our timeline. So we're always in the now, but we're moving from the past to the future. When we experience something, so experience X happens on day Y, um, that is then situated in a moment in our timeline. And as we move forward in time, if something happened in a specific moment in time, it will move backward into our past. And when things move backward into our past and we get some more distance between the past and the present, a natural evolution of our experience is that things in the past don't affect us in the same ways. So our thoughts about things, our relationship to past events, our feelings about past events evolve over time. Like how I feel about my divorce from my first wife today, 20 years later, is not the same as I felt right at the time. So my feelings, the quality of my emotional response has evolved over time, okay? Also, the magnitude has evolved over time. So that experience has been emotionally relocated more and more into my past so that today I am not experiencing those emotions, whatever they are, at the same magnitude as I did at the time when it was first happening. Okay. So task number 4 is emotionally relocating the event or events into our past by moving forward. Okay. Now, as complicated as that is to describe, it's easier said than done, right? And when I talk with dads going through divorce, sometimes even months into it, that part of the frustration is like, why is this still affecting me so strongly? You know, this is really rolling over on top of me, and I really want to get out from under this. And you know, there are lots of factors related to healthy coping and related to that evolving process of adjusting to the changes. But again, I think divorce is a particularly complicated situation of grief because it does entail so many adjustments to so many changes. Okay, that's part of the reason why you can't accomplish divorce grief in a day, no matter what you do, even if you do it perfectly. Okay, it's a process over time. But to recap, basically, we need to be able to deal with our emotions, both having the feelings, working with them constructively, letting them be, uh, you know, over time relocated into our past. We need to deal with the changes on a practical level, and we also need to adjust to an identity and what it means to be in a new universe that's configured differently now that things have changed. Okay. That's basically a summary of the task model. And it's much more flexible in understanding the wide variety of processes that different people go through in response to change and loss. Much better than the stage model, and it's much less likely to result in our thinking that we're failing at the grief process, right? Now, if you'd like to read another summary, that's a good summary of the task model, there's a good blog post on the Psychology Today blog. I'll put a link to that in the description in case you want to jump over there and read that. If you are, you know, very troubled by your grief, it's reasonable to see a therapist to help you with your grief. If you'd like to work with me, I have an online group where I have 3 weekly group coaching calls, and